The plane immediately left for Washington. The president's body was taken to National Naval Medical Center, Bethesda, Maryland. Well, of course, what we know that they skipped over is the discrepancy about that JFK, as a murder victim inside of the state of Texas, by law, should have undergone a Texas autopsy by a Texas-approved medical examiner. The Secret Service pulled out Tommy guns, pushed the autopsist to the wall, and told him, we're taking the president's body. And they did. So they skipped over all of that. They said nothing about any of that. Hello and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I am Jess, Connell, and I would love to earn your subscription today. We are in, I believe, part 41, maybe, of our walkthrough of the JFK assassination. We started out with the things that were happening prior to the assassination that set the stage. Then we walked through systematically through eyewitnesses and evidence and doctors' testimonies and all of the things that happened in the actual hours on either side of and during the assassination of our president. And since then, we have been walking through the investigative patterns. And today, we are actually going to be getting into the Warren Commission summary. Before we do that, I just want to say a few things. Number one, several of you have started sending me books from small and digestible to completely huge research tomes that I'm going to have to make time. I don't know how I'm going to get all this reading done, but there is so many fascinating books at this point. And, you know, silly me, I even went to the library recently and I got 2 more books. So I don't know if I'm going to get through any of those, but thank you to those who have mailed me books. What a generous thing you've done. I also want to say a special thank you to the listener who reached out and gave me recommendations for the kind of I think it's called lavalier mics that will help in field interviews, and then offered to purchase them for me. So they are charging right now. And tomorrow morning, I have this that I just ordered from Amazon. I don't know if you can tell what it's for, but Robert and Janet Groden invited me to go with him to redo the tape this time in advance of the November 22nd memorial. So, you know, life is crazy. I just released my Marianne Moorman interview video. A year ago, I could never have predicted that this would be my life, that I would be able to be involved actively in my own research. I had no foresight that this would become such a large part of my channel. But I'm so grateful because this is an area of fascination for me and apparently for many of you. I think it's an area of fascination for our country. And as I've thought about it, I hope you'll indulge me a minute just so I can share a big picture thought that I've been having more and more lately, which is, to me, the JFK assassination is sort of like if we were in a large family and there were tons of rumblings that we always heard about, cousins who won't see each other, an aunt who left and never returned to the family, somebody who was disowned or, you know, cut off from the family. And we don't really understand what all happened, but we know that the trouble began with Grandma and Grandpa's divorce in the 50s. Well, I personally believe that, like, if that had happened in my own family, one of the best things that I could do to understand the circumstances in which I was raised would be to get as much information as I could about Grandma and Grandpa's divorce. What did they believe? What led to it? Who was more at fault? Was it mutual? All the things surrounding that particular event that had seismic implications in our family's history. To me, the JFK assassination is like that for our nation's history. It's so significant. And I'm not the only one who thinks so. Thousands of books have been written, published, studying. This is one written by an assistant to H.L. Hunt, where he gives his particular insight to this Texas oil man and whether or not he could have. Some people think LBJ was the mastermind. There are people whose lives were affected because they were a part of the investigative aspect. So our family story as a nation has been impacted by these events and can't not be impacted by it. And so for me, sometimes I'll get comments of, why are you spending so much time on this? Like, come on, it was Jess, Lee, Oswald, let it loose. And in fact, we're going to get into that today in our read through of the summary of the findings of the Warren Commission. But the truth is, and we'll get into this in the coming episodes, that the American people have never bought what this volume was selling. They wanted to. Initially, all of the journalistic class welcomed and embraced this. And in fact, there were huge articles being written of how thorough and excellent it was on the day that it was released, which means, of course, if an article goes to publish about an 800 some odd page book and findings that is purportedly or should be so full of investigative and factual data, it should take you at least weeks to make a real and proper assessment of the thing. So for them to have released an article singing its praises within a day means that the article was written before the thing was ever accessible to be read. So our journalistic class was eager to embrace the Warren Commission report that was released. But one thing that we're going to get into is whether or not these documents and evidence and photographs and investigative details that are contained in the 26 volumes of the hearings and evidence, whether or not that matches the story that we were told here in this report that was supposed to be a summary. Mine is missing its cover, but this was supposed to be a summary of those 26 volumes. And our very next reading is going to get into whether or not this is even an accurate summary. But today we're going to get into that. I hope you will dig in with me. I know some of you have said, I won't listen to anything if it's Gerald Posner. And some of you may feel that about the Warren Commission, but I am of the mindset that we need to understand what the narrative is in order to know which elements have been more or less skewed and what story has been crafted so that we can understand what we've been lied to about, what has been manipulated for our understanding. So that's what we're going to do today. So we are starting out literally with page 1, chapter 1 of the Warren Commission report. The assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963 was a cruel and shocking act of violence directed against a man, a family, a nation, and against all mankind. A young and vigorous leader whose years of public and private life stretched before him was the victim of the fourth presidential assassination in the history of a country dedicated to the concepts of reasoned argument and peaceful political change. This commission was created on November 29th, 1963, just 1 week later, in recognition of the right of people everywhere to full and truthful knowledge concerning these events. This report endeavors to fulfill that right and to appraise this tragedy by the light of reason and the standard of fairness. It has been prepared with a deep awareness of the Commission's responsibility to present to the American people an objective report of the facts relating to the assassination. Well, to that, we all say, hooray, right? We all wish for a full and truthful knowledge concerning these events, the right and the ability to appraise these tragic events by the light of reason and standards of fairness. Yes, that's what we want, an objective report. So far we can all say, great, we're on the same page. We'll see how long that continues. Narrative of events, which is an interesting term. Narrative. I teach elementary writing, and a narrative is a storyline, and that is what we're going to be fed here. So let's listen to the narrative of events. At 11:40 a.m. Central Standard Time on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy, Mrs. Kennedy, and their party arrived at Love Field, Dallas, Texas. Behind them was the first day of a Texas trip planned 5 months before by the President, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, and John B. Connell, Jr., the governor of Texas. After leaving the White House on Thursday morning, the president had flown initially to San Antonio, where Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson joined the party, and the president dedicated new research facilities at the U.S. Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine. Following a testimonial dinner in Houston for U.S. Representative Albert Thomas, the president flew to Fort Worth, where he spent the night and spoke at a large breakfast gathering on Friday. Planned for later that day were a motorcade through downtown Dallas, a luncheon speech at the Trade Mart, and a flight to Austin, where the president would attend a reception and speak at a Democratic fundraising dinner. From Austin, he would proceed to the Texas ranch of the vice president. Evident on this trip were the varied roles which an American president performs: head of state, chief executive, party leader, and in this instance, prospective candidate for re-election. The Dallas motorcade, it was hoped, would evoke a demonstration of the president's personal popularity in a city which he had lost in the 1960 election. Once it had been decided that the trip to Texas would span 2 days, those responsible for planning, primarily Governor Connolly and Kenny O'Donnell, a special assistant to the president, agreed that a motorcade through Dallas would be desirable. The Secret Service was told on November 8th that 45 minutes had been allotted to a motorcade procession from Love Field to the site of a luncheon planned by Dallas business and civic leaders in honor of the president. After considering the facilities and security problems of several buildings, the Trade Mart was chosen as the luncheon site. Given this selection, and in accordance with the customary practice of affording the greatest number of people an opportunity to see the president, the motorcade route selected was a natural one. The route was approved by the local host committee and White House representatives on November 18th and publicized in the local papers starting on November 19th. This advance publicity made it clear that the motorcade would leave Main Street and pass the intersection of Elm and Houston Street as it proceeded to the Trade Mart by way of the Stemmons Freeway. So all of that is setting up. Here was the plan. Here was how it was supposed to go. By mid-morning of November 22nd, clearing skies in Dallas dispelled the threat of rain, and the president greeted the crowds from his open limousine without the bubble top, which was at that time a plastic shield, furnishing protection only against inclement weather. That's telling us, of course, it wasn't made of bulletproof glass, but, any talk about the bubble top, the real issue is it would have presented another barrier for any potential bullets. It presents a visual barrier in that the plastic can, slightly change how you view the president through it if you are an attempting assassin, but also a potential deflection of any bullets that would pass that barrier. To the left of the president in the rear seat was Mrs. Kennedy. In the jump seats were Governor Connolly, who was in front of the president, and Mrs. Connolly at the governor's left. Agent Bill Greer of the Secret Service was driving, and Agent Roy H. Kellerman was sitting to his right. Directly behind the presidential limousine was an open, hopefully they'll also tell us who was in front, because there was a front car. And that's an interesting set of details, but let's see. Directly behind the presidential limousine was an open follow-up car with 8 Secret Service agents, 2 in the front, 2 in the rear, and 2 on each running board. So 8 Secret Service agents in the one car that were directly behind the presidential limousine. These agents, in accordance with normal Secret Service procedures, were instructed to scan the crowds, the roofs, and windows of buildings, overpasses, and crossings for signs of trouble. I mean, if you have viewed that interview that I did with Vince Palomera, you know that there were as many as 15 different Secret Service norms that were breached for this visit. So this makes it sound like everything was done properly, all in one sentence. These agents were doing all the normal things. Well, the buildings had not been secured. The roofs were not being scanned, and there was much that had not been done. In fact, normal procedure under normal circumstances was for agents to ride on the back of the president's limousine and or run beside the president's limousine. That was not happening. Behind the follow-up car was the vice presidential car, carrying the vice president and Mrs. Johnson and Senator Ralph W. Yarborough. Next were a vice presidential follow-up car and several cars and buses for additional dignitaries, press representatives, and others. The motorcade left Love Field shortly after 11:50 a.m. and proceeded through residential neighborhoods, stopping twice at the president's request to greet well-wishers among the friendly crowds. Each time the president's car halted, Secret Service agents from the follow-up car moved forward to assume a protective stance near the president and Mrs. Kennedy. As the motorcade reached Main Street, a principal east-west artery in downtown Dallas, the welcome became tumultuous. At the extreme west end of Main Street, the motorcade turned right on Houston Street, which is the entry point to Dealey Plaza. So if you have seen Dealey Plaza with the Main Street is the middle street that comes down Dallas, when it gets to what will lead to the triple underpass, there's a branching of the roads that happens in Dallas, and you have to then take a right on Houston to get over to Elm Street where the president was assassinated. At the extreme west end of Main Street, the motorcade turned right on Houston Street and proceeded north for 1 block in order to make a left turn on Elm Street, the most direct and convenient approach to the Stemmons Freeway and the Trade Mart. As the president's car approached the intersection of Houston and Elm Streets, there loomed directly ahead on the intersection's northwest corner a 7-story orange brick warehouse and office building, the Texas School Book Depository. Riding in the vice president's car, Agent Rufus W. Youngblood of the Secret Service noticed that the clock atop the building indicated 12:30 p.m., the scheduled arrival time at the Trade Mart. So that's interesting because we just read an account of Jim Tague that said that he looked up right when he arrived at Dealey Plaza, when he saw the president's car beginning to come down Elm Street, and that it was 12:29. So it's interesting. I don't know if Youngblood was so far back that we've just witnessed the second hand changing the minute hand, but that's an interesting observation that contrasts or intersects in an interesting way with Jim Tague's testimony. The president's car, which had been going north, made a sharp turn toward the southwest onto Elm Street. At a speed of about 11 miles per hour, it started down the gradual descent toward a railroad overpass, under which the motorcade would proceed before reaching Stemmons Freeway. The front of the Texas School Book Depository was now on the president's right, and he waved to the crowd assembled there as he passed the building. This is the start of the famous Zapruder film. We see him waving, we see his hand slightly drop. Some people have surmised that that's the point at which the first shot was actually heard by the president, but potentially not recognized. There is a video. There's video evidence of where that first shot actually hit the pavement. There was an eyewitness testimony to that, and there is a white mark in the Zapruder film that shows that first film. So we see him go from lighthearted waving. Reportedly, Mrs. Connolly had remarked, "You can't say that Dallas doesn't love you now, Mr. President." And he said, "No, you sure can't." He's waving, things are good, they can see the triple underpass, and they know that that's the point at which they're going to get on to the freeway to head to the Trade Mart. Dealey Plaza, an open, landscaped area marking the western end of downtown Dallas, stretched out to the president's left. A Secret Service agent riding in the motorcade radioed the Trade Mart that the president would arrive in 5 minutes. Seconds later, shots resounded in rapid succession. The president's hands moved to his neck. They kind of did, but there is discrepancies about what was happening because he doesn't grab. Some people wrongly assume his hands go back. That isn't actually what happens. His hands come up like this. And so some people believe he was actually going to come all the way up to protect his face and head. Some people have said it's a neurological response, and some people think he was grabbing for his neck because that was the entry wound and it hurt. But what we don't see is grabbing. We see fists raised and elbows raised. So just so we're clear on the movement, the text here says the president's hands moved to his neck, which is true-ish, right? It's up in the at the level of his neck for sure. He appeared to stiffen momentarily and lurch slightly forward in his seat. A bullet had entered the base of the back of his neck, slightly to the right of the spine. Now, I want to point out, this is the bullet they are asserting. Remember, this is the one that they have moved, that the actual evidence shows 5 to 6 inches down in the back, but that they in the Warren Commission moved up to say the base of his neck, so that then it's accessible in order to come out here and then have any hope of going into the governor. So I just want to point out to you, we are already being given a narrative, which is what they promised us 2 pages ago, the narrative of events. This is a narrative, and it has a particular angle. It's purported to be the truth, but it is a narrative, and it is a narrative that we know already has some misapplied and misrepresented data. A bullet had entered the base of the back of his neck, slightly to the right of the spine. It traveled downward and exited from the front of the neck, causing a nick in the left lower portion of the knot in the president's necktie. Well, that also is a misrepresented piece of data, because they showed later that that nick had zero, gunpowder or lead residue on it. And that actually the testimony of the nurses was that it had been nicked by the scalpel when they were hurriedly trying to get the president's clothes off of his body at Parkland. So this is evidence being kind of tweaked out of necessity, when actually what happened is that a bullet entered here and went out there. So already we've been given a narrative. Before the shooting started, Governor Connell had been facing toward the crowd on the right. He started to turn toward the left and suddenly felt a blow on his back. Well, that also is not true. I'm trying not to stop all the time, but his own testimony is that he turned to the right to see the president and then had started to turn around when he felt the blow. If he had not turned to the right, then you could say, oh, maybe it makes it more credible that perhaps they were hit by the same bullet. But if Kennedy is hit, Governor Connolly turns and then goes to turn like this and then is hit, that actually is in the pattern of the bullets as the dicta belt sound indicates, but not the narrative that they wish to tell. He started to turn toward the left and suddenly felt a blow on his back. The governor had been hit by a bullet which entered at the extreme right side of his back at a point below his right armpit. The bullet traveled through his chest in a downward and forward direction, exited below his right nipple, passed through his right wrist, which had been in his lap, and then caused a wound to his left thigh. None of that is true about where his wrist was. You can go back to the episodes where we talk about ballistics and eyewitness testimony and Governor Connolly's testimony in order to sort these things out for yourself. But I'm going to try to keep reading in a linear direction of what the narrative that we are being presented with shows, and I will try to keep my comments to the big things. The force of the bullet's impact appeared to spin the governor to his right, and Mrs. Connolly pulled him down into her lap. Another bullet then struck President Kennedy in the rear portion of his head, causing a massive and fatal wound. The president fell to the left into Mrs. Kennedy's lap. Well, we did several episodes about the president's head wounds. I have more back in May of 2025 that I did, looking at all of the medical testimony. So you can look into that yourself. But this is saying all of the bullets came from the rear. It is indicating a 3-bullet scenario. And that is what you must believe if you are going to uphold the Warren Commission, that 3 bullets were fired. Only 3, no crossfire, all from one direction. Secret Service agent Clinton J. Hill, riding on the left running board of the follow-up car, heard a noise which sounded like a firecracker and saw the president suddenly lean forward and to the left. Hill jumped off the car and raced toward the president's limousine. In the front seat of the vice presidential car, Agent Youngblood heard an explosion and noticed unusual movements in the crowd. He vaulted into the rear seat and sat on the vice president in order to protect him. At the same time, Agent Kellerman in the front seat of the presidential limousine turned to observe the president. Seeing that the president was struck, Kellerman instructed the driver, "Let's get out of here. We are hit." He radioed ahead to the lead car. This is the first mention of the lead car, actually, but the lead car, my understanding had been that it had not been way in front of the motorcade until it hits Dealey Plaza, at which point it does get way out front, which is an interesting assertion. If you are saying that anyone knew in advance, then cars nearby would put some distance between them. But this is the first time I'm just pointing out that it's even been mentioned that there was a lead car. He radioed ahead to the lead car, "Get us to the hospital immediately." Agent Greer immediately accelerated the presidential car. We talked about this in our episode with Vince Palomera, that actually, sadly, Agent Greer was one who, the normal driver, the normal Secret Service agent who would have been driving at this moment, had what was termed a heart attack out at Camp David. There was no autopsy. His family found it suspicious. That's that. He was a younger man. So then the job of driving the president in Dallas was passed to Bill Greer, who was in his 40s, had slower reflexes, and actually in that moment, his hands stay on the steering wheel. So if you have ever been one of those people who has seen that tweaked Zapruder film where it shows the driver like taking the shot, well, Robert Groden has pointed out to me, Bill Greer would have had to have 3 hands for that to happen, because you can see his hands on the steering wheel. What you're actually seeing is Roy Kellerman's hair gel gleaming. The pomade that he was wearing is gleaming from the high noon sun at that particular moment. And you can tell when you stop and slow down and look at the frame. But Bill Greer did not turn around and shoot the president. But what he did do is do a double take. If you watch the film, he looks, and then he looks again before he guns it. So this makes it sound, it says specifically, Agent Greer immediately accelerated. Sadly not true. If he had done so when the first shot happened, we very well may have had an alive JFK post Dealey Plaza, but he did a double take. As it gained speed, Agent Hill managed to pull himself onto the back of the car where Mrs. Kennedy had climbed. Hill pushed her back into the rear seat and shielded the stricken president and Mrs. Kennedy as the president's car proceeded at high speed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, 4 miles away. It says he pushed her back. When you actually watch the video, he doesn't push her back. She gets down, and he may have given her verbal direction. She may have seen him coming and been responding to his movement, but it's not that he pushes her down. So that also is just not factually true. I do want to point out, I believe 2 of the 7 members of the Warren Commission did watch the Zapruder film, only 2. So there was that information actually available to them if they had wished to notice it. I believe also maybe the Nix film or much more. I am not conversant yet with all of the films to be able to reference exactly which ones show what, but one of the other films shows the Jackie moment very well. Hill pushed her back into the rear seat and shielded the stricken president and Mrs. Kennedy as the president's car proceeded at high speed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, 4 minutes away. At Parkland, the president was immediately treated by a team of physicians who had been alerted for the president's arrival by the Dallas Police Department as the result of a radio message from the motorcade after the shooting. The doctors noted irregular breathing movements and a possible heartbeat, although they could not detect a pulse beat. They observed the extensive wound in the president's head and a small wound approximately 1/4 an inch in diameter in the lower third of his neck. In an effort to facilitate breathing, the physicians performed a tracheotomy by enlarging the throat wound and inserting a tube. Totally absorbed in the immediate task of trying to preserve the president's life, the attending doctors never turned the president over for an examination of his back. At 1 p.m., after all heart activity ceased and the last rites were administered by a priest, President Kennedy was pronounced dead. I'm going to skip the part about the, LBJ taking the oath of office. We're just going to stick with the president's body. The plane immediately left for Washington. The president's body was taken to National Naval Medical Center, Bethesda, Maryland. Well, of course, what we know that they skipped over is the discrepancy about that JFK, as a murder victim inside of the state of Texas, by law, should have undergone a Texas autopsy by a Texas-approved medical examiner. The Secret Service pulled out Tommy guns, pushed the autopsist to the wall, and told him, we're taking the president's body. And they did. So they skipped over all of that. They said nothing about any of that. And now we're in Bethesda, where it was given a complete pathological examination, is what we're told. The autopsy disclosed the large head wound observed at Parkland and the wound in the front of the neck, which had been enlarged by the Parkland doctors. Both of these wounds were described in the autopsy report as being presumably of exit. Yes, but that doesn't mean that that's what the Parkland doctors would have described it as, but that is what the autopsy report described it as. In addition, the autopsy revealed a small wound of entry in the rear of the president's skull and another wound of entry near the base of the back of the neck. Again, that's that 5-inch discrepancy that basically was moved. The later President Gerald Ford is the one who actually just physically moved the wound in order to fit the pattern of evidence that they were seeking to assert happened. The autopsy report stated the cause of death as gunshot wound, head. And the bullets which struck the president were described as having been fired, quote, from a point behind and somewhat above the level of the deceased. At the scene of the shooting, there was evident confusion at the outset concerning the point of origin of the shots. Witnesses differed in their accounts of the direction from which the sound of the shots emanated. Within a few minutes, however, attention centered on the Texas School Book Depository building as the source of the shots. So they are saying within a few minutes, everything was clear. We have seen, even in our recent walkthrough of my interview with Marianne Moorman, that attention, you can see everyone running in a direction, and the direction in which they are running is the grassy knoll, not the Texas School Book Depository. No one was looking there. So it's interesting the way that they are saying there was discrepancy, but within a few minutes, all the attention centered here, which isn't shown to be true by even the photographic evidence, much less the eyewitness evidence. The building was occupied by a private corporation, the Texas School Book Depository Company, which distributed school books of several publishers. Most of the employees in the building worked for these publishers. The balance, including a 15-man warehousing crew, were employees of the Texas School Book Depository Company itself. I noticed that it's not mentioning that there was a work crew that was refinishing the floors that day. That isn't mentioned. Now, whether or not it's mentioned in the larger 26 volumes is something different, but it's not even mentioned here. And it's saying like, there's employees of the building, employees of the warehousing crew. It's about 15 men, when actually there was at least half a dozen, up to a dozen men that had been coming and going in the weeks surrounding the assassination because of that floor refinishing work. It just seems like an oversimplification to me. And it's an oversimplification. Again, I want to remind you of what Dr. Gary Aguilar says, which is if errors and omissions vary, some in favor of the Warren Commission outcome, some not in favor, then we can say, well, they just failed to mention it. But when all of the errors, omissions, and misrepresentations bend in the direction of the narrative, that tells us something. It tells us that data is being manipulated toward a particular view. Several eyewitnesses in front of the building reported that they saw a rifle being fired from the southeast corner window on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. One eyewitness, Howard L. Brennan, had been watching the parade from a point on Elm Street directly opposite and facing the building. He promptly told a policeman that he had seen a slender man, about 5'10", in his early 30s, take deliberate aim from the 6th floor corner window and fire a rifle in the direction of the president's car. Brennan thought he might be able to identify the man, since he had noticed him in the window a few minutes before the motorcade made the turn onto Elm Street. At 12:34, the Dallas police radio mentioned the depository building as a possible source of the shots. And at 12:45 p.m., the police radio broadcast a description of the suspected assassin based primarily on Brennan's observations. When the shots were fired, a Dallas motorcycle patrolman, Marion L. Baker, was riding in the motorcade at a point several cars behind the president. He had turned right from Main Street onto Houston and was about 200 feet south of Elm Street when he heard a shot. Baker, having recently returned from a week of deer hunting, was certain the shot came from a high-powered rifle. He looked up and saw pigeons scattering in the air from their perches on the Texas School Book Depository building. He raced his motorcycle to the building, dismounted, scanned the area to the west, and pushed his way through the spectators toward the entrance. There he encountered Roy Truly, the building's superintendent, who offered Baker his help. They entered the building and ran toward the two elevators in the rear. Finding that both elevators were on an upper floor, they dashed up the stairs. Not more than 2 minutes had elapsed since the shooting. When they reached the second floor landing on their way up to the top of the building, Patrolman Baker thought he caught a glimpse of someone through the small glass window in the door separating the hall area near the stairs from the small vestibule leading into the lunchroom. Gun in hand, he rushed to the door and saw a man about 20 feet away walking toward the other end of the lunchroom. The man was empty-handed. Some of these details you need to know are definitely disputed, but we're going to keep reading. There's an entire set of people and evidence, including Oswald's own words, that say he was holding a bottle of Coke, but this says the man was empty-handed. At Baker's command, the man turned and approached him. Truly, who had started up the stairs to the third floor ahead of Baker, returned to see what had delayed the patrolman. Baker asked Truly whether he knew the man in the lunchroom. Truly replied that the man worked in the building, whereupon Baker turned from the man and proceeded with Truly up the stairs. The man they encountered had started working in the Texas School Book Depository building on October 16th, 1963, just 5 weeks prior. His fellow workers described him as very quiet, a, quote, loner, end quote. His name was Lee Harvey Oswald. Within about 1 minute after his encounter with Baker and Truly, Oswald was seen passing through the second floor offices. In his hands was a full Coke bottle, which he had purchased from a vending machine in the lunchroom. So the assessment here, the assertion here by the Warren Commission is that he didn't have it, he purchased it, he's walking out with it. That is different than eyewitness accounts, and it's different than what Oswald himself claimed. He was walking toward the front of the building where a passenger elevator and a short flight of stairs provided access to the main entrance of the building on the first floor. Approximately 7 minutes later, at about 12:40 p.m., Oswald boarded a bus at a point on Elm Street 7 short blocks east of the depository building. I want to let you know Matt Douthit and I recently walked this route that they are about to lay out for us. And the timing doesn't work. But not only that, it is not 7 short blocks. It is 7 city blocks. It's quite a distance. It's a long distance. The bus was traveling west toward the very building from which Oswald had come. This is also something important. I want you to consider in your head, if you are a worker, you have just shot a significant figure on purpose. You know that you need to get away. And you know the layout of the city and the buses in order to get across to your town, to your home. I don't think you go back this direction to board a bus that you know is going to go right past the place of the action. That makes no sense to me at all. The bus was traveling west toward the very building from which Oswald had come. Its route lay through the Oak Cliff section in southwest Dallas, where it would pass 7 blocks east of the rooming house in which Oswald was living at 1026 North Beckley Avenue. On the bus was Mrs. Mary Bledsoe, one of Oswald's former landladies, who immediately recognized him. Oswald stayed on the bus approximately 3 or 4 minutes, during which time it proceeded only 2 blocks because of the traffic jam created by the motorcade and the assassination. Oswald then left the bus. A few minutes later, he entered a vacant taxi 4 blocks away and asked the driver to take him to a point on North Beckley Avenue, several blocks beyond his rooming house. The trip required 5 or 6 minutes. At about 1 p.m., Oswald arrived at the rooming house. The housekeeper, Mrs. Earlene Roberts, was surprised to see Oswald at midday and remarked to him that he seemed to be in quite a hurry. He made no reply. A few minutes later, Oswald emerged from his room, zipping up his jacket, and rushed out of the house. Approximately 14 minutes later, and just 45 minutes after the assassination, another violent shooting occurred in Dallas. Here, I have to pause and let you know that Roger Craig, one of the sheriffs, indicated that he heard the call come through about Tippet at 1:06 p.m. I believe Helen Markham, one of the witnesses, said she was on her way to the 109 bus, which would have placed it at 106 when she saw the shooting. It seems very likely there's also a document that was changed that has clearly been changed from 10 something to 115 for the time of death. So there are many indications that this time is a manipulated time, which had to be the case in order to remotely get close enough for Oswald to be there in time. But this is another significant point where there is discrepancy in the actual facts versus what's being presented here so clearly. They're just like, oh, about this time he entered this, and then 14 minutes later this other man passed away, and it all makes sense, and lickety-split, everything tied up neat in a bow, when actually you have Oswald arriving. He says he goes into his rooming house. She says he spends several minutes there. He exits, he goes and stands in front of the boarding house, and she says several minutes later, she saw him still standing there. That's 106. You're already past the time of actual death. Well, the victim was Patrolman JD Tippit of the Dallas Police, an officer with a good record during his more than 11 years with the police force. He was shot near the intersection of 10th Street and Patton Avenue, about 9/10 of a mile from Oswald's rooming house. At the time of the assassination, Tippit was alone in his patrol car, the routine practice for most police patrol cars at this time of day. He had been ordered by radio at 12:45 p.m. to proceed to the central Oak Cliff area as part of a concentration of patrol car activity around the center of the city following the assassination. Well, I don't believe that's true, actually. He was called and gave a wrong location as to where he was. There's very odd movements of Tippit at this time. At 12:54, Tippit radioed that he had moved as directed and would be available for any emergency. He was not at the location that he indicated over the radio. By this time, the police radio had broadcast several messages. alerting the police to the suspect described by Brennan at the scene of the assassination. A slender white male, about 30 years old, 5'10", and weighing about 165 pounds. I want to remind you, Oswald was 125, 130. He was a 23-year-old, I think 24-year-old man, like a very young man. So not 30s, not 165 pounds. And while the modern eyewitness might not know pounds very well, at that time people were very clued into weight and what body types looked like. And 165 was heavy for a person of that time period and that height. Oswald was not heavy at all. At approximately 1:15, Tippit was driving slowly in an easterly direction on East 10th Street in Oak Cliff. About 100 feet past the intersection of 10th and Patton, Tippit pulled up alongside a man walking in the same direction. The man met the general description of the suspect wanted in connection with the assassination. I want to point out that is the assertion of the Warren Commission. It's not a connection that is ever made by Tippit. He doesn't say, please hold, I might have a suspect. He doesn't indicate at all that he is stopping anyone. There's no communication about this, and this is just an assertion by the Warren Commission. He walked over to Tippit's car, rested his arms on the door of the right-hand side of the car, and apparently exchanged words with Tippit through the window. Tippit opened the door on the left side and started to walk around the front of the car. As he reached the front wheel on the driver's side, so the front wheel on the driver's side, he's not fully around the vehicle yet, he's just moving forward. The man on the sidewalk drew a revolver and fired several shots in rapid succession, hitting Tippit 4 times and killing him instantly. An automobile repairman, Domingo Benavides, heard the shots and stopped his pickup truck on the opposite side of the street, about 25 feet in front of Tippit's car. He observed the gunman start back toward Patton Avenue, removing the empty cartridge cases from the gun as he went. That's also an important issue. Whether or not it's an automatic ejection or a manual ejection matters. This witness says he was removing them. The shell casings were found off in the bushes. But there was discrepancy about which kind of gun had shot these shells. And there are discrepancies about which kind was found at the scene versus which kind Oswald actually possessed. Well, we are now on page 7 of a 27-page summary of the JFK assassination. But what we have read through has gotten us through the shooting of the president and the shooting of Tippit, and I am going to call it done. I hope that gives you enough of a taste of the way this narrative of events intersects with fact. Some of it is factual. Some of it we can say he did go here, he did work here, this did happen at this time. Some of it we have to say it wasn't Oswald. The time has been changed. Some of the details have been changed. Some of the direction of shots have been changed. And some things like the fighting about the actual autopsy isn't even mentioned. Isn't even alluded to. There's no indication that anything was amiss. And yet something was severely amiss because a murder happened in the state of Texas, and Texas law was not followed about that murder at the direction of the Secret Service. So there are a great many facts that have been toyed with. Some have been outright altered, like the time of death for Tippit. Some are sort of skirted over, like there was a little bit of discrepancy about where the direction of the shots come from, but within a few minutes, all of the attention centered on the Texas School Book Depository, which simply wasn't true at all. So that gives us a look at the credibility or lack thereof of the Warren Commission report on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. So I hope you enjoyed this read through. Next time we are going to be looking at Accessories After the Fact by Sylvia Marr. We're going to read through her introduction of the book, which was written as a response to the discrepancies that exist between this report and the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission hearings and evidence. So her book is one of those that if you are looking to look at the facts and understand the discrepancies between the official account and what Warren Commission critics believe, then this is the book that you want to get. That's what we're going to get into next time. I hope you'll come back for that. And I hope you'll let me know in the comments what you thought of the official Warren Commission report. Had you read part of it before? Have you read this entire book? I have not yet. I'm working my way through. And are you aware of the ways that it does deviate from the evidence found in these 26 volumes? That is what we're getting into next time. I hope you'll come back for that. We'll see you soon. Take care and have a great day. Bye.